So, good morning again, everyone. Thank you so much to so many of you for staying. This is wonderful turnout. And welcome to Chris as well. I just want to say that the Labyrinth, we worked very hard on planning and designing the Labyrinth for many, many years. The Labyrinth, I don't know if you're going to mention, is part of the overall wellness trail in Almont, of which the Seven Gifts site is part, and the activities along in the center of town. But I just want to highlight, you may have noticed that we recently, have a sign? I don't want to.
No, please do.
Okay.
I was going to leave some of this out just for the sake of time.
No, absolutely. Okay. Well, I just mentioned very, very briefly that if you've seen the Labyrinth recently, they have a beautiful new sign. And so I want to thank Peter, who designed the text, and Jen, who did the graphic design for the sign. And it's actually a picture of you on the sign. We can't see your face, but that's your back. And the sign explains basically what a labyrinth is and basic instructions on how to use it. So the sign is now in place, and we are having our official commissioning opening of the Labyrinth when the bishop is coming here on Thanksgiving Sunday in October. But today what we wanted to do is we wanted to invite Peter and Jen. Are you doing this? It's mostly Peter, okay. It's Peter. Peter will be coming. Peter will be giving a presentation on the Labyrinth, and he's going to be talking about his recent trip to France and his training that he undertook as a Labyrinth facilitator. So it's a God thing. Things just worked out perfectly that this all came about. And are you going to tell a story of how you found St. Paul's?
I'll include that.
You'll include that. I don't want to cover anything that Peter's doing. No, that's fine. But I just want to say, so this is Peter. That's the introduction. So please give Peter a warm welcome.
Well, this is a surprise. I think we expected about 10 people. And I bet you're here because you heard about the treats. So, yes, thank you for the introduction, Jonathan. I'm going to try to do this in half an hour, and I feel like I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to go through some of these slides quickly. But I do want to give you a sense of my experience with the Labyrinth and what brought me here as a facilitator, but also the Labyrinth brought Jen and I to this community in many ways. So I also want to talk about the history of the Labyrinth, and I think that's important because the history really is the genealogy of the Labyrinth we have here at St. Paul's. What's the relationship between, quite frankly, 18,000-year history behind this pattern and what we have out here in our beautiful lawn? And then I hope to finish up with how to use this thing. What do you do? And I'll right now put it right out there that there is no right way and there's no wrong way, but there are some guidelines that might be helpful to you. So let me jump into the introduction, which is, I'm going to start with me, my journey with the Labyrinth. Oh, and by the way, this is an image of the south facade of Chartres. I found the Labyrinth through Reverend Lauren Artress, who I'll talk about a little bit later. I found her book in 2005, Walking a Sacred Path. And I didn't really understand what it was going to offer me at the time because I was in transition in my career. I was working for the Army, and I was moving into a much more stressful position that would lead me to being diagnosed with severe PTSD and a long treatment plan. And what ended up happening, the Labyrinth plays a role. I went through about 5 years of treatment, which didn't really do a whole lot. And I ended up doing a residential treatment program for veterans and first responders in Perth. And they used a labyrinth. They used a full-size Chartres labyrinth built with stone in a forest. And that really opened my eyes to something as more than just a sacred tool, but also as a healing tool. And so from that, I became a labyrinth facilitator training with Lauren Artress. And during that training, she invited me to Chartres to do a pilgrimage followed by the advanced facilitator training, which I just did. So I came back from Chartres with Jen a week and a half ago, really. So as a result of that, training with Reverend Artress, I'll talk a little bit more about her because she's really quite important in what our awareness of the labyrinth in the modern context is. She's part of the modern revival. So she's the one who's trained me as an advanced labyrinth facilitator. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because I'm here available to you as members of St. Paul's if you've got any questions. Now, I'm not the only one. I know Sally has an awful lot of experience with labyrinths too, and so I'm sure she'll have some insight and some help along the way. I mean, Sally, you've built a beautiful portable canvas labyrinth.
That's right.
So I'm sure.
I've trained with Leonard.
Oh, you have too. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, what's your name?
Chris Hume, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
So I'm a volunteer labyrinth keeper with the Labyrinth in Carmen
See,
Place.
this is incredible because there's this exploding community, and we're just obviously getting to know each other along the way. And you might not know this, but there's about 25 labyrinths, public labyrinths, within about an hour's drive of Almont.
There's the Worldwide Labyrinth Locator,
We'll get to that.
which is in redesigned.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things I want to highlight with Chartres, because Chartres is one of those places that sort of brought labyrinths into modern awareness. Now Chartres has been a cathedral since 400 CE. Now part of its appeal is it's also been a pilgrimage destination for much of its history, and that has not stopped. Although the labyrinth may have fallen out of favor, and I'll talk a little bit about that, it has remained a pilgrimage destination. So a month before I got there was a worldwide youth pilgrimage to Chartres. 20,000 kids showed up. Only 2,000 could make it inside. The other 18,000 had to stay outside for the mass. And this is them. It was a 15-day pilgrimage for them. That includes some of it, of course, they did drive around, but they walked part of the pilgrimage route from Paris to Chartres.
How long is that?
3 days.
3 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've done that.
And you can continue, so that path continues to Santiago de Compostela. So El Camino, if you haven't heard about it. And Jen and I have pictures of us standing in front of the El Camino sign, which is just outside of Chartres. So it is a pilgrimage destination still, and that does play some roles in the labyrinth, so we'll talk about that. So before I get into the history, two definitions or distinctions I'd like to make. A labyrinth versus a maze. We often use those two terms interchangeably. Interestingly, in some languages, like in French, they don't actually have a word for maze. They use labyrinth for both, so that makes it confusing sometimes, but they are different. A labyrinth has one path in to a center, and you take the same path back out again. And the idea there is, you don't have to think about the twists and turns. You're not going to get lost in this thing. You can rest in a contemplative mental state. A maze, on the other hand, is much newer. They were built around the 1600s as basically entertainment for the aristocracy in England and France. And one of the oldest hedge mazes still remains at Hampton Court, built by King Henry VIII, and you can entertain yourself in this maze. It's designed to confuse you. It's got dead ends.
And it's successful.
It's got blind alleys. Some of them have puzzles to solve. So the difference between the two really is right brain, left brain. You've got to think your way through a maze. With a labyrinth, it's representative of an inner journey. So the other thing that's important too, quickly go through this, the classical versus medieval. So the St. Paul's Labyrinth is a medieval labyrinth, but that whole history began with something that's called a meander pattern. And we have evidence of this meander pattern going back 18,000 years. There's a figurine that was found in Ukraine with meander pattern looking like tattoos. That meander pattern became what we know as this guy on the far side. This is known as the classical labyrinth. It's 7 circuits. It's been linked to all kinds of different locations, but most famously Greece. But it actually predates the Greek myths. So, and I won't skip ahead too far. I do want to make a distinction. So, This is the classical. It eventually became the medieval pattern. Chartres is one version of the medieval pattern. There are many versions of it. And I'm going to give you a few more examples because you can still walk some of these. You can walk the Amiens one. It's been rebuilt. So classical, medieval, 7 circuits, most often 11 circuits. Circuits are the number of paths to the center. So the medieval pattern, I talked about the meander one that's 18,000 years old. That somehow, and we don't have all the history, evolved into this pattern around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. This particular example is from Galicia, Spain. That's about 2,000 years old, carved into rock. But there are a lot of them all over the world. There's these ones, but this doesn't even include the one. There's one in Egypt. There's one in Nazca, Peru. There's one in Nepal. And they all evolved at a time when many of these civilizations did not or could not have interacted with each other. So there's a little bit of mystery around how this archetypal pattern evolved. So, I feel like I want to make a reference to the sermon too, because you talked about the Romans. As in all things, the Romans change things. They adopt, they adapt, they improve even. So look, this is what happened. The Romans took this pattern and they created mosaic labyrinths. Now these weren't meant to be walked, but if you look at one quadrant, because this is what Romans did, they built their cities, they built battle fortifications in quadrants. One quadrant is a squared version of that classical design. It's the same pattern, and they've taken it, they've rotated 4 times 90 degrees, and they've connected them. So this is the next step along the evolution to what we have out here. Now these mosaic labyrinths were not meant to be walked. They weren't used to pray. They were probably used as ways to invoke protection for the household. They were placed on floors and on walls. And many of them are still visible for archaeologists, and some of them are available for viewing. And I think there's one in Pompeii that you can see. So this was around 300 to 400 CE. Skip ahead a couple hundred years to the 700s and 800s. The monks were now taking that pattern and they were turning it into a circle, and they were creating these are known as manuscript labyrinths. Now there's still 4 quadrants, you can see, and the walking path is still the same path, but it's been circled. And what's interesting about this middle one is you can see a monk trying to figure out where to put turns. This is a work in progress. They're figuring it out. This one here on the end, it's in Latin, but what's interesting, and this is relevant to Chartres, is you can see the name Maria, Saint Mary, the Virgin Mary. So before we get to Chartres, I do want to say that although Chartres is the more famous one, there are at least 8 cathedral labyrinths in France. And what's really interesting about the 8 is they're in one diocese, a large diocese, and there's a split. The northern labyrinths are this octagonal shape, and the southern labyrinths are circular. So this one here is at Amiens. It's been rebuilt, just north of Paris, and to this day you can go and visit it and you can walk it. This one no longer exists. This is from Rheims. It's the same pattern, but what they've done is they've sort of pulled a corner out and created these ramparts. But it hasn't changed the walking pattern. And in fact, there's at least one hospital I know in the States that's used this design as for their labyrinth that they want to use. Now, one of the things that characterizes these labyrinths, let me remind you that they're all in Roman Catholic cathedrals. Cathedrals are all characterized by the relics that they hold. So the relic at Amiens is a piece of John the Baptist's skull. So it has, and I haven't walked this, but I've got quite a few friends who have. And there's this very sort of cerebral, logical, sort of rigid way, a feeling about walking this one. Quite different than what we're going to talk about in Chartres. It also, those relics, by the way, also affect the way the priests deliver the liturgy. It really, they are very influenced by that. So Chartres, this is an overhead view of it. Chartres is technically a medieval 11th circuit left-handed labyrinth. So I think I've talked about medieval, I've talked about 11th circuits. What left-handed means is when you enter the labyrinth, the first turn you make is to the left. Now in Chartres, that's important too, because that first left-handed turn is also to the north. And Chartres is a pilgrim cathedral, so the north-south distinction is also important because the front of the cathedral's got 3 doors. There's the central royal door, but then it's got 2 pilgrim doors. Pilgrims enter on the north, which is they enter on the dark side, the cold dark, and they make their circuit exiting to the light. And the labyrinth is designed with that in mind. I also said that Mary is, so the proper name for Chartres is Notre Dame de Chartres, Our Lady of Chartres. The relic there is Mary's veil, and this is it. It has been carbon dated in the 1990s to first century Palestine based on the pollen that's still in that veil. Now what's interesting is this cathedral also has, in the cross over the altar, a relic of Christ's cross. But of course we know there's so many pieces of that there's maybe 4 or 5 crosses that went into those relics. Mary's veil is not like that. It was torn into a few pieces. Most of them were brought back together. There's still a few pieces missing, but there's only one veil. And so Mary plays an incredibly important influence in Chartres, in that particular labyrinth, in the design of the labyrinth, the way the liturgy is delivered, the way that the priests present their version of the Bible is based on Mary. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware, because I apologize, I'm Roman Catholic. I'm just learning about the Anglican Church, so I don't know if you do pilgrimage medals. This is a Roman Catholic thing, but when you go on pilgrimage, one of the things pilgrims used to do is they would collect a medal, usually a square thing about this big, and they would wear it, and then on that medal you could add a few other little smaller medals, usually for saints. But in the case of Chartres, the medal that a lot of people carry is, this is small, but it's Mary's veil. And this particular cathedral has a very long history of soldiers in France going to visit it before the First World War, but during the First World War and the Second World War, they would pray to Mary for protection, and they would carry one of these to war. And interestingly, in the stained glass over the choir, there are a lot of stained glass windows of knights who have visited Chartres asking for protection. Most of the rest of the stained glass is dedicated to the Old Testament on the north side, the New Testament on the south side, or to Mary. So before we get into some of that, one of the things I do want to talk about is sacred geometry, numerology, and its relevance to the Chartres Cathedral, because without a few of these features, a labyrinth can't be called Chartres. So first of all, it does have to have a rose center to be considered a Chartres labyrinth. The rose is one of several flowers that represent Mary. The lily, of course, is another one. What's interesting too is historically roses are graphically depicted with 5 petals. This one has 6. So again, a lot of thought has gone into this. This 6-petal rose, it's 6 petal, but it's got 7 circles. Its importance, its relevance is to the 7 days of creation. So what they did, if you can see this image here, there's a circle in the middle, 6 circles around the outside that touch each other. The creators slipped those 6 circles sideways just a little bit so they overlap, but it creates an entrance into the rose center. This is an invitation for a pilgrim to rebirth, mediated by Mary. The And each of the petals in the rose represent one of the 6 days of creation, with the center being the day of rest. Now this symbolism is mirrored in these guys around the outside. These little points, if you can see them, they're called lunations. Again, a sharked labyrinth has to have those lunations. So there's 112 of them. And at the entrance, there's a couple missing, which again represent an invitation to enter into the journey to the center to rebirth. The 112, so from a numerology perspective, and we know they were doing this because Shark actually hosted a school. And at that school, they learned the traditional curricula, which included astrology and Pythagorean math. So 112 in numerology, what you do is you add those digits up and you get one digit. So 1 plus 1 plus 2 gives you 4. 4 is representative of the square, stability. It's also, if you imagine those petals, represents the 4th day of creation. I don't know if should I test you? What did God create on the 4th day of creation? Humans. I think in the Bible they say man, but we'll say humans. God created humans on the 4th day. This is important, back to the rebirth theme, right? So 4. So if you take that 112 of those lunations, and you divide it by 4, which is the numerology number they represent, also remembering that there's 4 quadrants in this labyrinth, you divide that by 4, you get 28. Interestingly, even for a group of monks who are designing this, for them, 28 represented the average woman's cycle. So again, it's an invitation into an inner journey to find rebirth. So there's a lot more symbolism to this. I don't know that I have time to get into it, but we'll save time for questions at the end. But these are important features that many people, when they go on the tours, are introduced to, but are not necessarily aware of. And they really give a particular feel and experience when you're using this labyrinth. Oh yes, before I do that. So the other thing I wanted to point out too, these diagrams here show where the labyrinth was built in relation to the high altar. They are geometrically equidistant from their respective far walls. So the high altar is in the middle here. This is it here. So this distance is the same as the distance from the front door to the labyrinth. They're specifically designed to mirror each other's location inside the cathedral. Oh, what happened there? Okay, so one of the other things that's important about this labyrinth, not just I've mentioned a lot of references to Mary, but it was designed so that from the labyrinth, no matter where you were, you would see Mary. So there are well over 300 images of Mary, mostly in stained glass, but also in statuary, bas relief, and some sort of ornamentation. So this imagery was designed. What we have here is an image of where the labyrinth is and the major stained glass windows in the 4 cardinal directions. What I'm going to do is skip from there to the next one because you can see these stained glass windows here. Now what's important about this, everybody familiar with Lectio Divina?
Yes.
You're not? Okay. So Lectio Divina is a contemplative Christian practice of seeking guidance from using a quotation from the Bible. 2 ways to do it. You can randomly select one by opening the Bible and seeing what passage jumps out, or you can deliberately choose a passage. The Dominicans, for example, have an app that will send you a passage every day. It's called Amen. So we're familiar with that, but Visio Divina is a much older practice. It's in fact the original practice. Why? If you imagine in the Middle Ages, most people were illiterate. So the imagery, of course, was used to teach the Bible, but in the case of Visio Divina, it's also used to inspire. So pilgrims could wander the cathedral, and if one image in particular jumped out, then they would, in the Visio Divina practice, spend time with that image. Most of them would understand the context from the biblical context of that image. And so they would know, they wouldn't have to look it up or Google it. They would let the image speak to them, and they would spend time in contemplation with that image. So that's the practice of Visio Divina. And the labyrinth is designed in such a way that there are a lot of stained glass windows with the Old Testament on the north side, New Testament on the south side, and then on the upper clerestory windows, there were specific saints, including Mary. Right, so next what I'm going to do, I'm just conscious of time. How did we get from that to, before the modern labyrinth movement, the labyrinth fell out of favor? What happened? So there's a lot of speculation that people think the Roman Catholic Church thought this was a pagan symbol. Well, that's not the case. There's no evidence for that. There is some evidence today, but that's not how it fell out of favor. In fact, the evidence we do have is of bishops and priests writing letters complaining of kids playing in the labyrinth during Mass.
Very practical.
In fact, there's some suggestion that the labyrinth is the origin of the kids' game hopscotch. If you can imagine a kid going across one step, two steps, one step, two step, one step, one step, two step.
Oh my goodness.
So, the priests were ticked off with the kids. That's why it fell out of favor. It was not at that time considered a pagan symbol. In fact, there's a lot of symbolism in that particular church, but in most cathedrals that even today we would think they're pagan. There are 4 zodiac clocks in the cathedral. Right? They observed numerology and Pythagorean math and sacred geometry, which today we think, oh, that's pagan. No, this is a modern reinterpretation of what we actually don't understand. We're trying to fill in these gaps. It wasn't considered pagan then. So the modern labyrinth movement, it did fall out of favor. How did it come back into favor? It's not entirely clear, but one person who is vital in reintegrating it is Joseph Campbell. I don't know if you've heard of Joseph Campbell, very famous mythologist from the United States. He was a professor at Columbia University, and he wrote a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and a part of it illustrates this inner journey that all mythologies, all cultural mythologies teach. And because he identified each one had a similar pattern, he called it a monomyth, which we know as the hero's journey. That's Joseph Campbell. Now, when he was at Columbia, he was offered a 1-year fellowship in Paris. And when he was in Paris in 1927, he visited Chartres 8 times. And a couple of quotes, some of you can't read it, so I'll read them to you, but suffice it to say, Chartres became Joseph Campbell's favorite cathedral, so much so that on his visits, he spent so much time, he was invited to ring the bells. And there's actually a video of him doing that, because so today the bells are all on these mechanical electronic devices, but back then that's not less than 100 years ago, it was a seesaw sort of thing. These are big bells, so you'd have 2 people on a seesaw sort of jumping up and down, and these massive, so he did that. So the first quote, I think everybody who has spent any time at Chartres has felt something very special about this cathedral. I've been there about 8 times. One of the things that's important about these quotes too is the timing. So he was there in 1927, he wrote the book in 1949, it became very famous in Hollywood and basically is the reason why so many scripts are written the way they are. But in 1977 he did a series of interviews with Bill Moyers. Those interviews resulted in a book called Power of Myth, and that's where these are from. So this is not that long ago, 1977, and these quotes affected the pioneers who I'm going to talk about next. So the next one is, the labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path, and where we have thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. And where we have thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. And where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. So Joseph Campbell influenced a lot of people. But with regards to the Labyrinth movement, he influenced Jill Jeffreyon, Reverend Jill Jeffreyon, Reverend Lauren Artris, and an historian named Jeff Sabert. So those three people are the ones largely responsible for bringing the Labyrinth back to modern consciousness and awareness. Lauren Artris is the one who actually brought a physical labyrinth for the first time to the United States, to her cathedral, Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And now they've got two, one outdoor, the Terrazzo Labyrinth, and one indoor. But this is the book she wrote, Walking a Sacred Path. And this is my teacher. And, by the way, she has visited Ottawa. You've done some training with her.
My training
Yeah, you did.
was here in Ottawa in 2010.
Wonderful, wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful lady. Jen met her too, yeah. So all of that to say, this is all the history and everything that is behind the labyrinth that we have here at St. Paul's. So the St. Paul's Labyrinth is a medieval 5-circuit labyrinth. And it's in a wonderful location. For anybody who's walked it, it's got beautiful energy, partly because labyrinths do have an energy. And a lot of that energy comes from where they're located, where they're positioned. It's important to consider location. Not all labyrinths do. There's one in Stittsville that in the middle is the symbol for the, what's that?
Rotary.
The Rotary Club symbol. It kind of takes away from the spiritual sort of inner journey here. But here we have one bordered by the river, which is beautiful, a nice beautiful hedge, and St. Paul's. So what I want to do, actually one more thing before I get into this. St. Paul's has, if you didn't know, we've got 2 labyrinths. So next to the further bench, the further green bench, is a beautiful finger labyrinth. This is a classical 7-circuit finger labyrinth in brass. And I've got a couple of examples of other finger labyrinths. So whether it's for weather or physical mobility issues, you don't actually have to walk a labyrinth. You can put something like this on your lap, and you can trace the outline with your finger. Now, I like this one. It's a beautiful wood one. It can be costly. That one cost about $70. But there's nothing wrong with printing them out. And I know Jen's brought some that are the design of the St. Paul's Labyrinth, if anybody's interested. But I've got a few on paper, because you don't have to walk them if you can't, or if the weather's terrible. But you're feeling like some sort of need for a contemplative moment, maybe some inner guidance. You don't have to walk it if it's not available to you. So, we're going to shift into the part, how do you use this thing? And so before I get into the guidelines for how to use it, I just want to clarify a couple of things, questions that I found have come up frequently. I think that's one of the things that people wonder about a public labyrinth like that. The first one is, well, if somebody's already in it, what do I do? Join in. This labyrinth could probably hold 5 or 6 people comfortably. This is not a solitary thing. The labyrinth is designed as a way to reflect your outer life. It's a reflection of your inner life and your outer life. So if there are other people in the labyrinth, that's not to stop you. And in fact, having other people in the labyrinth experience may offer you the insight you need. And I'll talk a little bit about that. What do I do if I meet someone? If you're in the labyrinth and you cross paths with somebody, we'll talk about that too. Again, there are no rules. It really isn't all that different if you were to cross paths with somebody on the sidewalk. Shoulder them aside, step sideways, you'll figure it out. If somebody's noisy or disruptive, see you, Sarah, it might happen. I mean, generally, you hope that somebody would be respectful, but if somebody is, the invitation is actually to not necessarily challenge them, but to look at and examine your own reaction to that. That might be the guidance for that day. And what do you do at the center? Well, we'll talk about that too. So, the basic guidelines, it's like everyday life. Kindness, courtesy, and respect. How do you use it? There are so many different ways you can use it. You can use it for prayer. You can use it for contemplative reasons, just to center yourself, just to find calmness and peace. Maybe you're struggling with a question, like a creative question. Maybe you want to write a book. Maybe you want to paint your house. Maybe you want to change jobs. I don't know, maybe you want to help somebody and you're stuck and you're seeking some sort of clarity on the creative approach you're looking for. This is a great place to do it. Maybe it's just exercise, and that's okay too. You know, there's nothing wrong with kids running around this thing and having fun. That's okay too. But if you are going to use it for sort of looking for some contemplative guidance, some spiritual guidance, or maybe you have an intention or a question you want to try to figure out, here's some general guidelines. So the first part, before you even get into the labyrinth, just take a few moments, take a moment to settle, much like Jonathan begins our services. Why? Because by the time you get to that first step in front of the labyrinth, you've probably been grocery shopping, or mowing the lawn, or maybe you've been golfing, or maybe you had a meeting at work or somebody ticked you off. Well, you don't really want to bring that into the labyrinth. This is a chance to let that go. Maybe you've been at the doctor's office and you're struggling with some difficult health issues. This is a chance to really let that go and go inside. So once you've had a few moments to settle, whatever feels right to you, it is useful to set an intention. And an intention can be, it should be an open-ended question. You don't want to ask the labyrinth or God, should I do this or should I do that? It really is about asking for guidance. It's about sharing what it is you're struggling with and asking a question along the lines of, please show me the next step. Please offer me some guidance. Please help me see a better way, or a new way, or a way I hadn't thought of. So that last one, expectations can hinder your experience. I think this is the fourth or fifth one of Jonathan's points, right? This is the same here. And I'm going to quote Lauren because I can't beat this. She's got an awesome line. If you're expecting to get Shazammed, you'll get disappointed. A lightning bolt is not going to strike you. And I think one of the things, she also shares a really interesting story. She set up a practice and one of the ladies had done everything. Now this lady was a scientist. She was very methodical. She was very strict and regimented. And she did all the steps perfectly. She walked the labyrinth. And every now and then, Lauren could see her getting annoyed. She was getting frustrated in there. But because it's a labyrinth, you don't intervene. You let a person have their experience. And this person left, and Lauren walked up to her and said, I noticed you were having a tough time. Would you like to share with me what happened? She said, yeah, I did everything you said. I took a moment to pause. I set an intention, and I was focused on that intention, and the angels kept singing. The very experience that most people would dream for is taking her off because you interrupted. So you know, that's not always going to happen, but another experience, Jen was walking the St. Paul's Labyrinth on Wednesday. Jen was having a tough day at work, and she was asking the labyrinth for some guidance, and she was in the center facing the river, asking for guidance, and she felt a nudge on her thigh, or I guess her back of her leg, and it was a cat. The cat had joined her at the center, and then rolled over on the paver stones. And that was the message, that was the guidance. So, you know, what does guidance look like? What does divine guidance look like? You know, sometimes it can be very, very subtle. So subtle you might not notice it. And I think sometimes the voice that it comes in sounds an awful lot like our own voice. And so you can question it. But if you spend enough time with the different voices in your head, you know that there's an ego voice, and there's a different voice that's not that one. And it is subtle. And so it does take wisdom to discern the difference. And that's the voice you probably hear. So when you actually do the walk, you set your intention. The process really is quite simple. The beginning part of the walk is a release. A releasing of not just the outer world, but maybe whatever might be holding you back from receiving, because that's the next part. It doesn't have to be right in the middle, somewhere in the middle, maybe on the way out, is receiving, being open to receiving whatever guidance is coming your way. Not what you want, but maybe what you need. And then after you've finished in the middle and the receiving part is happening, the next part is return. And again, this is symbolic. This is going back to Joseph Campbell's work. It's a return from an inner journey to the outer world. There's a return. And once you've left the labyrinth, it's probably worth taking some time to reflect. What happened? What does it mean to you? Because the other thing is, nobody's going to give you the answers. You're the one who's asking the question. This is an inner journey. And maybe you might want to share it with somebody, but the answers are going to come to you through you. Oh. That's really it. So I guess maybe the next part, because I'll leave this open for questions. I just want to leave some resources here. The first one is myself. I'm a member of the St. Paul's congregation, and I'm a advanced Labyrinth facilitator. So if anybody's got questions, I'm available to answer questions. I'm also happy to offer guided or facilitated walks in the labyrinth, and I'll be available after this to do that. Lauren Artris. She's probably the primary instigator. There's got to be a better word than instigator. Facilitator of the modern labyrinth movement. Now, Jill Jeffreyon, she's a reverend. She also does a lot of work there, but what she does is she specializes in Chartres, and very specifically in the art and imagery of Mary in Chartres and how to use that for both pilgrimage journeys to Chartres and walking the labyrinth. So they often work together, and they did for me. Veriditas, that's the organization through which I'm certified. It is the organization that Lauren Artris founded, I think almost 30 years ago. The Labyrinth Society is another really, really well-documented resource. And related to the Labyrinth Society is this worldwide labyrinth locator, and it has just been redesigned. But basically, this is where, if you're curious, if you're traveling anywhere in the world, you want to see if there's a labyrinth nearby, they've got well over 6,000 labyrinths documented, and I think we hope to be on that list. So, open to questions. I think I kept the time. One thing I did want to say, I was going to read from this because just one line. Again, on the pagan piece, people wonder, especially in Roman Catholic context, if the church views it as a pagan symbol. So this is from the cathedral, and this is sort of a tour guide of the cathedral. But what they say about the labyrinth, a symbol of the path leading us from the earth towards God. They don't see it as pagan. Sally.
I just want to mention that just as people were concerned that it's pagan, people are also often concerned that it's only Catholic. But in fact, Grace Cathedral is an Episcopal Anglican cathedral, and
Yes.
and they're definitely interdenominational symbol activities.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. And I think that's an interesting point because all of the cathedral labyrinths are in Roman Catholic cathedrals, but the modern labyrinth movement is being revived by the Anglican and Episcopal Church. The reason the Chartres Cathedral is open its labyrinth to the public on Fridays, which it took several years for them to agree to do that, is because Jill Jeffreyon and Lauren Artris worked with the bishop of Chartres Cathedral not once or twice, but over many, many, many years to convince them in the 90s that this is not pagan and that it will serve the Chartres congregation. And so, because of the Episcopal Anglican interest and revival, the Roman Catholic Church is sort of, I would say, slowly, maybe reluctantly following suit. Yeah.
Veritas or Veri.
Oh, Veritas.
Yeah.
It means greening. It's
Yeah.
like the greening power.
Well, greening the earth.
Greening
Right.
the earth, yeah. Well, and what's interesting too, in Chartres, a lot of the crosses that depict Jesus are green.
So you mentioned the history of the labyrinth evolving in many different cultures in a parallel way when there was no connection. You mentioned how it's been used in Christianity and so on and so forth. Is walking the labyrinth, is it always a spiritual act, or can one have, I mean, obviously you don't have to be Christian to enjoy a labyrinth. Do you have to be spiritual?
No, you don't.
Tell us more.
No, so you could have people from our community in Almont walk this labyrinth for a secular reason. Maybe it could be meditative. A lot of people are working with mindfulness meditation these days, and people working with meditation often find themselves having a difficult time sitting on a cushion or a chair in a corner and focusing on their breathing. So an alternative is walking meditation, and the labyrinth is one form of walking meditation that works for a lot of people. Partly because the act of walking does enough to keep your mind occupied on the act while your subconscious can relax. It can also be used to just ask, I mean, I say creative questions because I'm also an artist and a writer. And so sometimes I find myself sort of stuck. And I'll go in there and get an idea. So it doesn't have to be spiritual. It can be really, honestly, anything. If it speaks to you, it can be used any way that suits you. Is that
Yes,
what you're-
that's good, thank you. You mentioned walking meditation.
Mhm.
Is one of the descriptions of the labyrinth, is it sometimes described as walking prayer? Or is that something that I've just read and
No,
confused?
it's being used as a walking prayer. In fact, Jill Jeffrions wrote a book on praying the labyrinth. And so there are a lot of, similar to using a rosary. At each corner, you can say a different prayer. You can use it like a rosary and say the rosary prayers at each corner. So there are two types of corners in the labyrinth. There are 90-degree corners, and then there's 180-degree corners. So you would say different prayers for each. And it doesn't have to be the rosary prayer. There are different prayers that you can use. Unfortunately, I don't have enough of a repertoire to fill in more, except to say that there are a lot of different ways that you can pray the labyrinth from Christian prayers, yeah.
Or even just going in with an intention that you're asking for guidance, that can be
And
prayer.
praying to God in that
Yeah.
way, yeah, please show me the way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just an example, I did a whole series of labyrinth walks a number of years ago, and in my intention, what I wanted to do was get a visual of a mandala when I was resting at the center, and then I'd come out and I actually drew it. So I did like a series like that, and it just really helped me in my, sort of starting my creative journey.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I noticed that Esther had a question, I know
Oh,
Sue did
sorry,
too.
sorry.
Just a quick part, just, listening to Jonathan's question. It's also a really good way to work through complicated emotions.
Absolutely.
And you might walk the labyrinth and come with question and be open. And maybe you come back out, and it could be even days later when you get some kind of insight. And I
Yeah.
think it's because you opened yourself up.
So it's been used in grief work a lot, and there are now a couple of labyrinths, including one out in British Columbia, where they have, I can't remember the name of it, but there's a telephone box. and it's designed in such a way that you can, as you say your final goodbye to a loved one, you can then go to that phone and speak to them. The labyrinth has also been used in trauma work, not just in a military perspective, but also, I mean, trauma covers a wide range of terrible experiences. The Royal Mental Health Centre, for example, also has a labyrinth. There's another big mental health center called Homewood near Peterborough. They have a labyrinth. So labyrinths, Johns Hopkins in the States, a lot of hospitals are using labyrinths. And it's not
Hospices, I think.
hospices too. And it's not just the patients who are using them. The physicians and the staff are using them too. So a lot of context. So Sue, you had
Well, I have a couple of comments actually.
Sure.
I think we need to work on our use of the word pagan. My experience with indigenous teachings and so on, they were regarded as pagan, which I think probably a better word might be superstition. Because it
Yeah.
just means from the country, pagan.
right. Well, I use the word because that is the word that's used by the church who tries to dismiss it.
Well,
So in
yeah,
that
but
context,
doesn't mean
I
we
agree.
shouldn't
You're
work
right.
on this.
You're right.
You could call it pre-Christian.
Pre-Christian,
Or something.
yeah, or, I mean, and maybe the difference between religious and spiritual, I mean, all the examples that you're giving, when people have an experience of something coming to them,
Mhm.
they haven't made happen, I don't call that a spiritual experience, whether you're talking about art, or emotional healing, or any of these things. But it isn't necessarily in the Christian framework.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree, but I think qualifying an experience like that should be up to each individual, however they, because
Well, sure.
it's a complicated sort of spectrum, and I think to make it really inclusive, being open and curious to whatever experience happens, we might be able to call our experience spiritual, somebody else might just call it eye-opening or heart-opening on a really positive note. But I do understand the distinctions. It's really hard to, I think, include everybody's experiences. in
Well, I don't
one word.
disagree that people for themselves
Yeah.
describe it however they want. But my own understanding,
Mhm.
I would not classify them as not spiritual.
Okay. Sally?
I just want to say one other use, I've done a lot with kids at schools, and they are very social. And the leadership is the labyrinth itself, it's not any kid. And because the twists and turns, they high-fiving each other as they pass.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great way, I think, to introduce kids to a tool like that might serve them well later in life.
I was just going to say, I was at shop when I was a kid. We lived in England, and we took off in a camper. My parents, I didn't drive, and we went over to France and visited everywhere. So as a child, you kind of dismissed most stuff because you'd rather be doing anything but going to museums and old churches, right? But I still distinctly remember going to shop. And there was a presence and an atmosphere there, unlike any of the other, churches I had visited, pretty much since as well.
Yeah.
Even as a child. And I remember this 50 plus years later.
Do you remember the labyrinth?
I vaguely do, but I also remember that it was cordoned off.
Yeah.
And but the whole like I'm literally getting goosebumps just thinking about this from more than 50 years ago.
Jen and I had the same experience there. Walking into the cathedral, it's got a really grounding, calming, welcoming, nurturing sort of feel to it. It's a beautiful place, and it's got a different feel than other cathedrals. One other thing I'll add is that it is the site is pre-Christian, and in the basement, in the crypt of the cathedral, is an old well that was used by the Druids, so pre-Roman. And it is also the site of prayer to a virgin goddess, predating the Virgin Mary. So it used to be a site of prayer to Diana, interesting. I don't know if it's a coincidence or an evolution or what, but Wendy.
No, I just have a comment, because, I mean, obviously there's this wonderful atmosphere in an ancient building. The first time I ever walked a labyrinth was an indoor one. It was at the Galilee Retreat Center. It was just a big canvas with it, as Sally knows. And I had the most amazing experience. So you don't have to, be in this ancient building.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's also a testament to the value of canvas labyrinths. Yeah, I think the atmosphere helps, but it's not necessary because really the atmosphere is something that we can generate ourselves. But there is also something special about the particular geometry of labyrinths that is, I would say, something we can't really explain. All of the shark labyrinth, for example, mathematicians to this day have not figured out how the math was used to build that. Our engineers can duplicate it. They can take an image and do an AutoCAD image of it and recreate it, but they haven't figured out the math. Part of it is because they're trying to use algebra and trigonometry, whereas the math at that time was Pythagorean and it was numerology and it was designed as, like, geometry is the math of relationships.
When did they fall out of favor? You mentioned that the priests didn't want children running on the labyrinth. Approximately what century was this?
Approximately 16th century, I believe.
So around the time of the Reformation.
Yeah, well, probably, yeah. That would have been just, yeah.
So it was used from, say,
It was used for
1,000 years almost. And then,
it was. So Chartres Cathedral was initially built, this current iteration is the 6th iteration.
oh, yes.
So this particular version was built in the 1200s, around between 1201 and 1210. And that's when the labyrinth was installed at that point. So that was at the time of the Crusades. And it's possible, we don't have proof of this, but one possible speculation is that it served as an alternate pilgrimage route for pilgrims going to Jerusalem, which would not have been safe. But it is, regardless, it's still on the pilgrim route to Santiago de Compostela. Rodney?
I don't quite know how to phrase this without sounding as if I don't believe in this. But was the change that came around, I think around 100 years ago, less than 100 years ago, which kind of took it away from the Roman Catholic thing. Was that a deliberate thing because people would just say, oh, that's one of those Catholic things, that venerating the saints and all this kind of thing?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can answer that. The Roman Catholics have been slow to pick up on it, but why was it brought back the way it was? I feel like this is a very human question about so many problems in the world at that time, which haven't gotten worse, and people looking for something that's missing in their lives. And Joseph Campbell was answering that by identifying the power of myth. That's the title of one of his books. And how myths have been told in all cultures across centuries as ways of describing inner journeys and transitions through major points in our lives. From birth to death, marriage, returning from war. And part of those myths also included the use of ritual, something else that we've lost. And so I think people we're talking the 1920s when Joseph Campbell did his work, people were struggling with the aftermath of World War I. And there was a lot of, I think, soul searching. Now, I'm speculating. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church was going one way, and the rest of the world was going a different way. I'm not sure if I can answer the question directly. I can only speculate.
But it was, at that time, was postmodernism, right? So the aftermath of the war and everything was kind of uncertain, and
Yeah.
technology was developing quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. And so in some ways, people were looking for, some people were looking for a return to tradition and certainty and so on. And that may be one reason why that developed at that time. But it's interesting because he was in the 1920s, but then Lauren Artress and others were not till the 70s.
Lauren Artress was 1990, so early, I think 91.
So what happened between him and her? Was there not much happening?
It was mostly him until the 1970s. So he's the one, he did that interview with Bill Moyers in 1977, which is still available on YouTube and PBS. It was a PBS series of interviews. And it was those interviews that influenced, I think, a lot of people like Lauren Artress and Jill Jeffrey on it.
It wasn't until the 1990s that it kind of flourished. And,
she's got a wonderful story of her. She was, I think, I would have to say, spiritually called to Chartres. She can't even explain it herself. And when she got there, the church itself, they had chairs, wooden chairs over the labyrinth. And she couldn't find anybody interested in helping her learn about it. So she, I don't want to use the word snuck in, but she got a few of her friends and they moved all the chairs aside on their own. And they weren't interrupted, but it was through that kind of work and over time exposing it to the church and the history that she dug up that allowed them to recognize it as something useful, as a spiritual symbol. It's interesting now, though, the church is clamping down partly because, so one thing to understand about all churches in France, the Roman Catholic Church is a large landowner, except in France. In France, since the French Revolution, the French government owns all that property. So one of the problems France is facing now is there's a lot of terrorist threat. And so the sacristans, so these are people who work for the diocese and they facilitate some of the masses and they also act as security. They're watching anybody who's going anywhere near the labyrinth because they're concerned that it might be used as a symbol against the state and the church. So some of our friends, while we were there, spent a little bit too much time standing in the center of the labyrinth, and they were ushered out.
That won't happen here. That won't happen
No,
here.
that won't happen here. So there's some concern both from the church, but also from the state security apparatus at play here.
I should have prefaced my comment about saying how much I find this very interesting and informative. Really appreciative. But I want to comment on this question of what happened between the 1920s and the 70s.
Yeah.
Remembering my experience in the early 60s as a teenager.
Were you at Woodstock?
I was a wannabe. It was the Death of God period. I remember sermons about the book and Your God is Too Small and a whole discussion about theism and a shift to experiential approach. For example, and as a Roman Catholic, a little later after this piece, we did the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius and Lectio Divina, and it was taking us into, and the United Church, which never would have put out, say, an Advent wreath, started to talk about the Christian year and all that kind of thing. Like, I remember that through my young adulthood and so forth, and discovering spiritual practices as kind of a antidote to this intellectual sort of go down a rabbit hole and never come out debate.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because the Ignatian path, I found, sorry to put you on the spot, but I found Jonathan's sermon this morning very Ignatian.
Yeah.
The Ignatian prayer is about inviting you to imagine yourself in a scene in the Bible. And you sometimes hear the Pope use that word imagine, and that's because he's Jesuit. So I found the way you did that was wonderful. Like, it really did invite me anyway into the imagery that you were creating, which is Ignatian.
when Pat came back from Iona, she tried to encourage us a little bit
Yeah.
using that and sort of visual work art and stuff, but it didn't take here.
You talked about 2 books. One was Power of Mix. What was the other book?
Walking a Sacred Path.
Can you email me your PowerPoint?
Sure.
And then maybe we can put a link to it in the newsletter, or certainly the links that you had up, the websites at the end. I'll put those in the newsletter this week so that you can go to all of those websites.
Esther?
I have a very practical question.
Sure.
Because I'm curious, what does a labyrinth facilitator do?
What?
What does a labyrinth?
Oh, okay. So, a couple of things. The first part is this. A first part of it is just helping people understand what it is and how it can be used in a lot of different any context. But the second part is facilitating labyrinth walks, which is essentially holding space. As a labyrinth facilitator, our jobs is not to intervene, and we're not gatekeepers, but we're there to sort of hold space so that people can feel safe and secure that they can walk this thing. And if they need guidance, there's some available. It's not much more than that, really. But I think a lot of it is offering that the confidence for people who are new to it, that they've got somebody that they can look to for questions and answers, and for somebody to. Another big part of it, though, is when we do facilitated walks, there is an element of ritual. And so it's about setting a particular tone, and that's going to be different for based on the context. So it's going to be different for a trauma walk versus a sort of a spiritual inner walk or a grief walk. And so part of the role is to set a sort of a ritual tone so that people can enter into that heart space, drop out of their minds, and start to feel from the heart center, and hopefully enjoy a labyrinth experience from this place rather than this place.
The other thing that the Labyrinth does is it gives you jobs. So, I mean, I started volunteering with the Carleton Place Labyrinth in 2009. Well, the Labyrinth decided that I was its keeper. So I am still doing that.
And Chris, don't you have workshops from time to time?
We have this year, though I backed off and we aren't doing events because I'm working on completely rejuvenating, restoring the gardens at the Labyrinth.
Right.
It's a lot of
And
work, isn't it?
I'm the spokesperson for the Labyrinth.
I think this is what Wendy's doing
This
for
is
ours.
like, it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
Well, I often meet you first.
But I like the way, and I deliberately do not use that sort of terminology, but the labyrinth does have an energy of its own, and it does sort of guide you to what it needs, right?
Can I just let everybody know, Chris here lives across from the parish house and was very instrumental in helping myself and Jonathan put the whole grant application together too. So thank you, Chris, for all your
Right.
I got the impression you were just saying, or have just said recently, about people facilitating.
Mm-hmm.
So, 2 or 3 people or 50 people turn up and you do instruction and.
Yep.
So, but you said earlier, right at the beginning, that no more than about 4 or 5 people.
In this particular labyrinth, because it is a fairly small one, and so for this one, what we would do, say there's 10 or 15 people in a walk, we would set up in here and have a place for people to, and depending on the context and what it is we're trying to engage in. But one of the things I might do is something like this: offer people exercises on how to actually draw their own labyrinth. And we would do that in here. And if there was a particular theme like grief, we would do some work around that in here. And then there would be 2 or 3 people. Maybe Jen might help me, maybe Chris. And so one person would be out at the labyrinth, making sure that there's space. And one of the things we would do is keep spacing between people so 2 people aren't entering at the same time.
Right.
So facilitating that. and then somebody in here with the other people and sort of helping them go back and forth. It would work that way.
I just am intrigued in the
mechanics?
mechanical mind. You know, I like everything very odd.
So it can get very, very difficult. Lauren Artris tells a story. The first time she opens the Shark full-size 11 circuit, 50-foot Shark Labyrinth in Grace Cathedral, she had 2,000 people show up.
Oh my gosh.
So it took 12 hours and a lot of patience. So yeah, it can call a lot of people, and you need to be prepared for that. In the end, the point really is to make sure that the people in the labyrinth have the best experience that they can have. I think that's good.
Thank you for doing it so much.
Yeah, thank you.